What if I told you that the most isolated island from the most isolated inhabited island in the world was Napoleon Bonaparte's last residence? This is the story of the island of St. Helena. St. Helena is the closest piece of land to Tristan da Cunha, which I mentioned in the previous episode. And those two islands are part of the same British overseas territory called the Overseas Territory of Ascension Island, St. Helena, and Tristan da Cunha. Now, St. Helena has quite a few more people on the island than does Tristan da Cunha, which had a population at last count of 282. St. Helena, on the other hand, has a population of a little over 6,000 residents. And its capital town is Jamestown, which is down on the coast, down the hill, with a population of about 700. And the largest settlement on the island is called Half Tree Hollow, which is up the hill overlooking Jamestown. It's kind of a suburb, but it's got a population of a little under 1,000. Those two settlements are connected by a very, very long ladder called Jacob's Ladder, which is like 660 some odd steps from the bottom to the top. The fastest ascension of the ladder was a little over 6 minutes. And however, the two settlements are also connected by a very winding switchback road, of course. And unlike Tristan, private car ownership is very common on St. Helena. Now, and unlike Tristan, you can fly to St. Helena. Tristan requires an ocean-going ferry or boat or shipping boat to reach, and a boat that only travels about 9 times a year, as I mentioned before. St. Helena, on the other hand, has an airport with commercial flights that fly from South Africa and Namibia at last count about 3 times a week. St. Helena built and opened this airport a little under 10 years ago. Before that, St. Helena could only be accessed by a ferry and a ship, but due to its higher population, those ships also sailed a lot more frequently than the ones to Tristan da Cunha. Now, I mentioned at the top that this was Napoleon's last home, which is true. Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena in 1815. He was defeated in 1814, was exiled to the Italian island of Elba, which, it's like, have you ever seen Elba? This place is gorgeous. It's tropical. It's warm. A lot of things that St. Helena is not, being in the South Atlantic. Whereas Elba, of course, is off the shores of Sicily. A lot more comfortable weather-wise than St. Helena. However, Napoleon, being Napoleon, always was plotting and conniving to escape Elba to go back to France and reclaim the throne. In order to prevent this from happening, the French and British authorities had him exiled to St. Helena, which of course is a British overseas territory, which put the British in charge of his captivity. A former farm was converted to a house for the sole purpose of housing Napoleon. He moved in 1815, and he lived out the rest of his life there until his death in 1821. Longwood House is located deeply into the interior of the island and fairly considerably far from Jamestown or Half Tree Hollow. And this was, of course, very much and very rightfully by design. The government of France owns Longwood these days, even though it is on a British overseas territory, because it did house and was purpose-built to house the former French emperor. And in the 6 years that he lived at Longwood, he complained very frequently of the cold, complained very frequently of the high humidity, both of which, unfortunately for that locale, are very true. And he was under the watchful eye of British Governor Hudson Lowe, who was appointed as the governor of St. Helena during that time. Governors are still assigned to those territories to the state, so not much has changed in that regard in all these years. But he complained frequently that Lowe had unreasonable conditions of his captivity, wouldn't allow him to go anywhere, do anything, or see anything. What is not mentioned, though, is that even amongst all Napoleon's belly aching, Lowe did aggressively try to have a new, kinder, gentler, purpose-built house for Napoleon to be built. This is a work that started in 1819. The house was completed, but unfortunately Napoleon never moved in. And he would continue to live at Longwood for another 2 years until his own passing in 1821. Napoleon was allowed to have a small, I don't want to say secret service, but kind of a secret service of sorts, but kind of a crew or brigade that he was allowed to have for his own personal security and comfort his own servants, if you will. Entourage, that's the word I was looking for. He had his own entourage, and they stayed in the mansion with him. And yes, Longwood was considered a mansion, even though it was converted from farm purposes and agricultural purposes to a remodeled barn, basically, to house Napoleon. St. Helena, to this day, is a tourist spot for people who are Napoleon aficionados, and they go to visit Longwood for the purposes of, well, touring his last residence. So it gets a lot of tourism in that regard. And there are some offbeat tourists that go there. I would not say it's a large industry for the island, but it is really the island's place in history, is as the last home of captivity of Napoleon. There are some fishing, economic activities on the island, just like Tristan da Cunha. There are some services in Jamestown and some shopping retail in Jamestown, which actually does set this island also apart from Tristan for that reason. There are banks, institutions, restaurants, and things like that. And it has a deep water port that Tristan does not have. It also, of course, has a high elevation, and unlike Tristan, St. Helena is not volcanic. And it's really just this offbeat tourism crowd of basically curious explorers who are there for the purposes of curiosity in regards to Napoleon's last surroundings, as well as just the shit. They're almost there for almost the isolation of it, which is very true. It's still 700 miles west of the South African and Namibian coastline. And the flight goes from flights to St. Helena actually go from Johannesburg, South Africa, but they also do have a fueling and pit stop in Windhoek, Namibia, which is the capital city of Namibia. And it is, so it's a two-step flight, but you don't change planes. A small plane with about 20 some odd seats makes the trip on a thrice weekly basis. And so that is basically what St. Helena is like today. It's a place with a few thousand. Again, like Tristan, these people are considered British residents, and they have British privileges. And many aspects of St. Helena are very British. You'll find the typical British phone booths there. You'll find pubs there. The most interesting thing about St. Helena is that if you do go to visit, they don't take MasterCard and Visa on the island. The only banking services that are available to tourists really on the island are through the Bank of St. Helena. You bring your currency and your cash from wherever you're coming from, and you can deposit in a tourist bank account on the island, and they will give you a St. Helena Island debit card, and you use it to purchase your items, food, meals, etc., and even lodging on the island with that card. And unlike St. Helena, where there's no private, for-profit lodging, St. Helena does have that. And it does have hotels. I wouldn't even call them hotels, probably more like, motels. I wouldn't call them motels really, because it's not that of a, there's not like really like a budget motel would be here in the United States, but they're not luxury hotels either. This island does not have those. And so, but there are for-profit businesses that do provide lodging on the island. You can rent a car on St. Helena as well to get around. So if you don't want to climb up 660 steps of Jacob's Ladder to get from one settlement on the island to another, you can rent a car on the island, and you can rent a car at the St. Helena airport to drive into town or drive up to the rest of the settlements on the island. And you can even drive away to Longwood House to visit Napoleon's last residence. So anyway, that is the story of St. Helena. The people who live there are actually called the Saints, and there's pages about them on the internet. A page included called "What the Saints Did Next," which is kind of a day-to-day kind of a chronicle of what life is like on St. Helena. There are very interesting stories told on this island, but there is, unlike its fellow island of Tristan da Cunha, St. Helena does have cars, roads, internet access, and much more in terms of modern amenities, and it does have a much more friendlier tourist infrastructure, and of course to support all the Napoleon history seekers. It's just like all of them. I mean, they get a few thousand a year, but it's hardly a flood, but it's enough to be a reasonable source of income for the island, and it does provide a few jobs for people who work at these motels, restaurants, shops, and things like that inside of Jamestown. The population of the island is on a slow downward trajectory because there isn't much in terms of wealth creation. Much of the economic engine of St. Helena is ancillary supporting of the small tourist industry that they have, as well as basic services for the island's inhabitants. Things like grocery stores, banks, as I mentioned before, the Bank of St. Helena, and utilities and things like that, and a handful of jobs at the airport itself. So that is the story of St. Helena, the final residence of Napoleon Bonaparte. I'll also mention, I'm not mentioning what day that these are being filmed for nowadays, because I'm stacking them up and I'm thinking about my ideas much quicker than the calendar runs. So you're watching definitely a previously filmed version of this, and I just upload them on a daily basis, but I do have them stacked a few deep right now, and I do have a good library, and I can do one a day right now and just upload them, and they're backed up, and I can also film as I upload. So that's going to be how this is going to work going forward. And that is the story of St. Helena. Peace out, homies.